Hello and welcome back. It's obviously bedtime, and I, of course, am obvious. We're back for part 2 of The Mysterious Affair at Styles by Agatha Christie. Thank you so much for joining me. So, last time, it's been a week already. We met quite a cast of characters. We met the Cavendishes, John and Lawrence, and John's wife, Mary, Cynthia. We met Evie, Hercule Poirot, and, of course, our narrator, Hastings. And Mrs. Inglethorpe, who was, we believe, poisoned, although I don't believe we've confirmed that within the story yet or not. And, So today we get to start with Chapter 7. It isn't strychnine, is it? By the way, I have included a poll, assuming everything works correctly, of course, for this stream, where you'll be able to vote whether on who you believe the murderer is who killed Mrs. Inglethorpe. It should pop up in the chat every so often with an option to type in a vote command. It'll be an exclamation mark, then vote, followed by the first name of the character, or in the case of a character like Dr. Bauerstein, their last name. And just double check. I'm just double checking Streamlabs right now to make sure that the poll is actually turned on. And there we go. All right, excellent. So you'll be able to see the results in real time as we go through the stream. I've also, for those of you who joined early enough, added a timer to the stream and a few other things. I'm working on some image masking and other things that I've never done before. So hopefully that'll make the stream a little more appealing, a little more attractive than a black box with a admittedly cool sand art in it. Although I know the main point of this stream is to listen to the story. So, I'm glad you like it, Vela. All right, I wonder if I can vote on this. Hey, look at that. Alfred did seem the suspicious type, although I have a private theory about him if anybody wants to find somewhere to discuss after the stream. I think he is more than meets the eye, so to speak. All right. Well, I've got a mug of tea, I've got a good book, and I've got good company with all of you. So let's begin. Chapter 5. It isn't strychnine, is it? Where did you find this? I asked Poirot in lively curiosity. In the wastepaper basket. You recognize the handwriting? Yes, it is Mrs. Inglethorpe's. But what does it mean? Poirot shrugged his shoulders. I cannot say, but it is suggestive. A wild idea flashed across me. Was it possible that Mrs. Inglethorpe's mind was deranged? Had she some fantastic idea of demoniacal possession? And if that were so, was it not also possible that she might have taken her own life? I was about to expound these theories to Poirot when his own words distracted me. Come, he said, now to examine the coffee cups. My dear Poirot, what on earth is the good of that, now that we know about the cocoa? Oh la la, that miserable cocoa, cried Poirot flippantly. He laughed with apparent enjoyment, raising his arms to heaven in mock despair, in what I could not but consider the worst possible taste. And anyway, I said, with increasing coldness, as Mrs. Inglethorpe took her coffee upstairs with her, I do not see what you expect to find, unless you consider it likely that we shall discover a packet of strychnine on the coffee tray. Poirot was sobered at once. Come, my friend, he said, slipping his arms through mine. Ne vous fâchez pas. Allow me to interest myself in my coffee cups, and I will respect your cocoa. There. Is it a bargain? He was so quaintly humorous that I was forced to laugh. and we went together to the drawing room, where the coffee cups and tray remained undisturbed as we had left them. Perrault made me recapitulate the scene of the night before, listening very carefully and verifying the position of the various cups. So, Mrs. Cavendish stood by the tray and poured out. Yes. Then she came across to the window where you sat with Mademoiselle Cynthia. Yes. Here are the 3 cups, and the cup on the mantelpiece, half drunk. That would be Mr. Lawrence Cavendish's. And the one on the tray? John Cavendish's. I saw him put it down there. Good. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But where then is the cup of Mr. Inglethorpe? He does not take coffee. Then all are accounted for. One moment, my friend. With infinite care, he took a drop or 2 from the grounds in each cup, sealing them up in separate test tubes, tasting each in turn as he did so. His physiognomy underwent a curious change, an expression gathered there that I can only describe as half puzzled and half relieved. Bien, he said at last. It is evident. I had an idea, but clearly I was mistaken. Yes, altogether I was mistaken. It is strange. But no matter. And with a characteristic shrug, he dismissed whatever it was that was worrying him from his mind. I could have told him from the beginning that this obsession of his over the coffee was bound to end in a blind alley, but I restrained my tongue. After all, though he was old, Perrault had been a great man in his day. Breakfast is ready, said John Cavendish, coming in from the hall. You will breakfast with us, Monsieur Perrault? Perrault acquiesced. I observed John. Already he was almost restored to his normal self. The shock of the events of the last night had upset him temporarily, but his equable poise soon swung back to the normal. He was a man of very little imagination, in sharp contrast with his brother, who, perhaps, had too much. Ever since the early hours of the morning, John had been hard at work, sending telegrams. One of the first had gone to Evelyn Howard, writing notices for the papers, and generally occupying himself with the melancholy duties that a death entails. May I ask how things are proceeding, he said. Do your investigations point to my mother having died a natural death? Or must we prepare ourselves for the worst? I think, Mr. Cavendish, said Perrault gravely, that you would do well not to buoy yourself up with any false hopes. Can you tell me the views of the other members of the family? My brother Lawrence is convinced that we are making a fuss over nothing. He says that everything points to its being a simple case of heart failure. He does he? That is very interesting. Very interesting, murmured Perrault softly. And Mrs. Cavendish? A faint cloud passed over John's face. I have not the least idea what my wife's views on the subject are. The answer brought a momentary stiffness in its train. John broke the rather awkward silence by saying with a slight effort, I told you, didn't I, that Mr. Inglethorpe has returned? Perrault bent his head. It's an awkward position for all of us. Of course, one has to treat him as usual, but hang it all, one's gorge does rise at sitting down to eat with a possible murderer. Perrault nodded sympathetically. I quite understand. It is a very difficult situation for you, Mr. Cavendish. I would like to ask you one question. Mr. Inglethorpe's reason for not returning last night was, I believe, that he had forgotten the latchkey. Is not that so? Yes. I suppose you are quite sure that the latchkey was forgotten, that he did not take it after all? I have no idea. I never thought of looking. We always keep it in the hall drawer. I'll go and see if it's there now. Perrault held up his hand with a faint smile. No, Mr. Cavendish. It is too late now. I am certain that you would find it. If Mr. Inglethorpe did take it, he has had ample time to replace it by now. But do you think? I think nothing. If anyone had chanced to look this morning before his return and seen it there, it would have been a valuable point in his favor. That is all. John is sus, eh, Vella? John looked perplexed. Do not worry, said Perrault smoothly. I assure you that you need not let it trouble you. Since you are so kind, let us go and have some breakfast. Everyone was assembled in the dining room. Under the circumstances, we were naturally not a cheerful party. The reaction after a shock is always trying, and I think we were all suffering from it. Decorum and good breeding naturally enjoined that our demeanor should be much as usual, yet I could not help wondering if this self-control were really a matter of great difficulty. There were no red eyes, no signs of secretly indulged grief. I felt that I was right in my opinion that Dorcas was the person most affected by the personal side of the tragedy. I pass over Alfred Inglethorpe, who acted the bereaved widower in a manner that I felt to be disgusting in its hypocrisy. Did he know that we suspected him, I wondered? Surely he could not be unaware of the fact, conceal it as we would. Sorry, just updating something really fast. Did he feel some secret stirring of fear, or was he confident that his crime would go unpunished? Surely the suspicion in the atmosphere must warn him that he was already a marked man. But did everyone suspect him? What about Mrs. Cavendish? I watched her as she sat at the head of the table, graceful, composed, enigmatic. In her soft gray frock with white ruffles at the wrists falling over her slender hands, she looked very beautiful. When she chose, however, her face could be sphinx-like in its inscrutability. She was very silent, hardly opening her lips, and yet, in some queer way, I felt that the great strength of her personality was dominating us all. And little Cynthia? Did she suspect? She looked very tired and ill, I thought. The heaviness and languor of her manner were very marked. I asked her if she was feeling ill, and she answered frankly, "Yes, I've got the most beastly headache." "Have another cup of coffee, mademoiselle?" said Poirot solicitously. "It will revive you. It is unparalleled for the mal de tête." He jumped up and took her cup. "No sugar," said Cynthia, watching him, as he picked up the sugar tongs. "No sugar? You abandoned it in the wartime, eh?" "No, I never take it in coffee." "Sacré," murmured Poirot to himself, as he brought back the replenished cup. Only I heard him, and glancing up curiously at the little man, I saw that his face was working with suppressed excitement, and his eyes were as green as a cat's. He had heard, or seen something that had affected him strongly. But what was it? I do not usually label myself as dense, but I must confess that nothing out of the ordinary had attracted my attention. In another moment the door opened, and Dorcas appeared. "Mr. Wells to see you, sir," she said to John. I remembered the name as being that of the lawyer to whom Mrs. Inglethorpe had written the night before. John rose immediately. "Show him into my study." Then he turned to us. "My mother's lawyer," he explained, and in a lower voice. "He is also coroner, you understand. Perhaps you would like to come with me?" We acquiesced and followed him out of the room. John strode on ahead, and I took the opportunity of whispering to Poirot. "There will be an inquest, then?" Poirot nodded absently. He seemed absorbed in thought, so much so that my curiosity was aroused. "What is it? You are not attending to what I say." "It is true, my friend. I am much worried." "Why?" "Because Mademoiselle Cynthia does not take sugar in her coffee." "What? You cannot be serious." "But I am most serious. There is something that I do not understand. My instinct was right." "What instinct?" "The instinct that led me to insist on examining those coffee cups." "Chut! No more now." We followed John into his study, and he closed the door behind us. Mr. Wells was a pleasant man of middle age, with keen eyes and the typical lawyer's mouth. John introduced us both and explained the reason of our presence. "You'll understand, Wells," he added, "that this is all strictly private. We are still hoping that there will turn out to be no need for investigation of any kind." Quite so, said Mr. Wells soothingly. "I wish we could have spared you the pain and publicity of an inquest, but of course it's quite unavoidable in the absence of a doctor's certificate." "Yes, I suppose so." "Clever man, Bauerstein. Great authority on toxicology, I believe." "Indeed," said John, with a certain stiffness in his manner. Then he added rather hesitatingly, Shall we have to appear as witnesses? All of us, I mean? You, of course, and Mr. Inglethorpe. A slight pause ensued before the lawyer went on in his soothing manner. Any other evidence will be simply confirmatory, a mere matter of form. I see. A faint expression of relief swept over John's face. It puzzled me, for I saw no occasion for it. If you know of nothing to the contrary, pursued Mr. Wells, I had thought of Friday. That will give us plenty of time for the doctor's report. The post-mortem is to take place tonight, I believe? Yes. Then that arrangement will suit you? Perfectly. I need not tell you, my dear Cavendish, how distressed I am at this most tragic affair. Can you give us no help in solving it, monsieur? Interposed Poirot, speaking for the first time since we had entered the room. I? Yes. We had heard that Mrs. Inglethorpe wrote to you last night. You should have received the letter this morning. I did, but it contains no information. It is merely a note asking me to call upon her this morning, as she wanted my advice on a matter of great importance. She gave you no hint as to what the matter might be? Unfortunately, no. That is a pity, said John. A great pity, agreed Poirot gravely. There was silence. Poirot remained lost in thought for a few minutes. Finally, he turned to the lawyer again. Mr. Wells, there is one thing I should like to ask you. That is, if it is not against professional etiquette. In the event of Mrs. Inglethorpe's death, who would inherit her money? The lawyer hesitated a moment and then replied, The knowledge will be public property very soon. So, if Mr. Cavendish does not object— Not at all, interpolated John. I do not see any reason why I should not answer your question. By her last will, dated August of last year, after various unimportant legacies to servants, etc., she gave her entire fortune to her stepson, Mr. John Cavendish. Was not that, pardon the question, Mr. Cavendish, rather unfair to her other stepson, Mr. Lawrence Cavendish? No, I do not think so. You see, under the terms of their father's will, while John inherited the property, Lawrence, at his stepmother's death, would come into a considerable sum of money. Mrs. Inglethorpe left her money to her elder stepson, knowing that he would have to keep up Styles. It was, to my mind, a very fair and equitable distribution. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. I see. But I am right in saying, am I not, that by your English law, that will was automatically revoked when Mrs. Inglethorpe remarried? Mr. Wells bowed his head. As I was about to proceed, Monsieur Poirot, that document is now null and void. Hein, said Poirot. He reflected for a moment and then asked, Was Mrs. Inglethorpe herself aware of that fact? I do not know. She may have been. She was, said John unexpectedly. We were discussing the matter of wills being revoked by marriage only yesterday. Ah, one more question, Mr. Wells. You say her last will. Had Mrs. Inglethorpe then made several former wills? On an average, she made a new will at least once a year, said Mr. Wells, imperturbably. She was given to changing her mind as to her testamentary dispositions, now benefiting one, now another of her family. Suppose, suggested Poirot, that unknown to you, she had made a new will in favor of someone who was not, in any sense of the word, a member of the family. We will say Miss Howard, for instance. Would you be surprised? Not in the least. Ah, Poirot seemed to have exhausted his questions. I drew close to him while John and the lawyer were debating the question of going through Mrs. Inglethorpe's papers. Do you think Mrs. Inglethorpe made a will leaving all her money to Miss Howard? I asked in a low voice with some curiosity. Poirot smiled. No. Then why did you ask? Hush. John Cavendish had turned to Poirot. Will you come with us, Monsieur Poirot? We are going through my mother's papers. Mr. Inglethorpe is quite willing to leave it entirely to Mr. Wells and myself. Which simplifies matters very much, murmured the lawyer, as technically, of course, he was entitled. He did not finish the sentence. We will look through the desk in the boudoir first, explained John, and go up to her bedroom afterwards. She kept her most important papers in a purple despatch case, which we must look through carefully. Yes, said the lawyer, It is quite possible that there may be a later will than the one in my possession. There is a later will. It was Perrault who spoke. What? John and the lawyer looked at him startled. Or rather, pursued my friend imperturbably, there was one. What do you mean there was one? Where is it now? Burnt. Burnt? Yes. See here. He took out the charred fragment that we had found in the grate in Mrs. Inglethorpe's room and handed it to the lawyer with a brief explanation of when and where he had found it. But possibly this is an old will? I do not think so. In fact, I am almost certain that it was made no earlier than yesterday afternoon. What? Impossible! Broke simultaneously from both men. Perrault turned to John. If you will allow me to send for your gardener, I will prove it to you. Oh, of course, but I don't see. Perrault raised his hand. Do as I ask you. Afterwards you shall question as much as you please. Very well. He rang the bell. Dorcas answered it in due course. Dorcas, will you tell Manning to come round and speak to me here? Yes, sir. Dorcas withdrew. I don't know, Dorcas is a little sus. We waited in intense silence. Perrault alone seemed perfectly at his ease, and dusted a forgotten corner of the bookcase. The clumping of hobnailed boots on the gravel outside proclaimed the approach of Manning. John looked questioningly at Perrault. The latter nodded. Come inside, Manning, said John. I want to speak to you. Manning came slowly and hesitatingly through the French window, and stood as near as he could. He held his cap in his hands, twisting it very carefully round and round. His back was much bent, though he was probably not as old as he looked, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent, and belied his slow and rather cautious speech. Manning, said John, this gentleman will put some questions to you, which I want you to answer. Yes, sir, mumbled Manning. Perrault stepped forward briskly. Manning's eyes swept over him with a faint contempt. You were planting a bed of begonias round by the south side of the house yesterday afternoon, were you not, Manning? Yes, sir, me and Willem. And Mrs. Inglethorpe came to the window and called you, did she not? Yes, sir, she did. Tell me in your own words exactly what happened after that. Well, sir, nothing much. She just told Willem to go on his bicycle down to the village and bring back a form of will or such like. I don't know what exactly. She wrote it down for him. Well? Well, he did, sir. And what happened next? We went on with the begonias, sir. Did not Mrs. Inglethorpe call you again? Well, yes, sir, both me and Willem, she called. And then? She made us come right in and sign our names at the bottom of a long paper, under where she'd sign. Did you see anything of what was written above her signature? Asked Perrault sharply. No, sir, there was a bit of blotting paper over that part. And you signed where she told you? Yes, sir. First me and then Willem. What did she do with it afterwards? Well, sir, she slipped it into a long envelope and put it inside a sort of purple box that was standing on the desk. What time was it when she first called you? About 4, I should say, sir. Not earlier? Couldn't have been about 3:30? No, I shouldn't say so, sir. It would be more likely to be a bit after 4, not before it. Thank you, Manning. That will do, said Perrault pleasantly. The gardener glanced at his master, who nodded, whereupon Manning lifted a finger to his forehead with a low mumble and backed cautiously out of the window. We all looked at each other. Good heavens, murmured John. What an extraordinary coincidence. How a coincidence? That my mother should have made a will on the very day of her death. Mr. Wells cleared his throat and remarked dryly, Are you so sure it is a coincidence, Cavendish? What do you mean? Your mother, you tell me, had a violent quarrel with someone yesterday afternoon. What do you mean? Cried John again. There was a tremor in his voice, and he had gone very pale. In consequence of that quarrel, your mother very suddenly and hurriedly makes a new will. The contents of that will we shall never know. She told no one of its provisions. This morning, no doubt, she would have consulted me on the subject, but she had no chance. The will disappears, and she takes its secret with her to her grave. Cavendish, I must fear there is no coincidence there. Monsieur Perrault, I am sure you agree with me that the facts are very suggestive. Suggestive or not, interrupted John, we are most grateful to Monsieur Perrault for elucidating the matter. But for him, we should never have known of this will, I suppose. I may not ask you, Monsieur, what first led you to suspect the fact? Perrault smiled and answered. A scribbled-over old envelope and a freshly planted bed of begonias. John, I think, would have pressed his questions further, but at that moment the loud purr of a motor was audible, and we all turned to the window as it swept past. "Evie!" cried John. "Excuse me, Wells." He went hurriedly out into the hall. Perrault looked inquiringly at me. "Miss Howard," I explained. "Ah, I'm glad she has come. There is a woman with a head and a heart too, Hastings, though the good God gave her no beauty." I followed John's example and went out into the hall, where Miss Howard was endeavoring to extricate herself from the voluminous mass of veils that enveloped her head. As her eyes fell on me, a sudden pang of guilt shot through me. This was the woman who had warned me so earnestly, and to whose warning I had, alas, paid no heed. How soon and how contemptuously I had dismissed it from my mind. Now that she had been proved justified in so tragic a manner, I felt ashamed. She had known Alfred Inglethorpe only too well. I wondered whether, if she had remained at Styles, the tragedy would have taken place, or would the man have feared her watchful eyes. I was relieved when she shook me by the hand, with her well-remembered, painful grip. The eyes that met mine were sad, but not reproachful. That she had been crying bitterly I could tell by the redness of her eyelids, but her manner was unchanged from its old gruffness. "Started the moment I got the wire. Just came off night duty. Hired car. Quickest way to get here." "Have you had anything to eat this morning, Evie?" asked John. "No." "I thought not. Come along. Breakfast's not cleared away yet, and they'll make you some fresh tea." He turned to me. "Look after her, Hastings, will you? Wells is waiting for me." "Oh, here's Monsieur Perrault. He's helping us, you know, Evie." Miss Howard shook hands with Perrault, but glanced suspiciously over her shoulder at John. "What do you mean, helping us?" "Helping us to investigate." "Nothing to investigate. Have they taken him to prison yet?" "Taken who to prison?" "Who? Alfred Inglethorpe, of course." "My dear Evie, do be careful. Lawrence is of the opinion that my mother died from heart seizure." "More fool Lawrence," retorted Miss Howard. "Of course Alfred Inglethorpe murdered poor Emily, as I always told you he would." "My dear Evie, don't shout so. Whatever we may think or suspect, it is better to say as little as possible for the present. The inquest isn't until Friday." "Not until fiddlesticks!" The snort Miss Howard gave was truly magnificent. "You're all off your heads. The man will be out of the country by then. If he's any sense, he won't stay here tamely and wait to be hanged." John Cavendish looked at her helplessly. "I know what it is," she accused him. "You've been listening to the doctors. Never should. What do they know? Nothing at all, or just enough to make them dangerous. I ought to know. My own father was a doctor." "That little Wilkins is about the greatest fool that I have ever seen. Heart seizure. Sort of thing he would say. Anyone with any sense could see at once that her husband had poisoned her. I always said he'd murder her in her bed, poor soul. Now he's done it. And all you can do is to murmur silly things about heart seizure and inquest on Friday. You ought to be ashamed of yourself, John Cavendish." "What do you want me to do?" asked John, unable to help a faint smile. "Dash it all, Evie, I can't haul him down to the local police station by the scruff of his neck." "Well, you might do something. Find out how he did it. He's a crafty beggar. Dare say he soaked flypapers. Ask Cook if she's missed any." It occurred to me very forcibly at that moment that to harbor Miss Howard and Alfred Inglethorpe under the same roof and keep the peace between them was likely to prove a Herculean task, and I did not envy John. I could see by the expression of his face that he fully appreciated the difficulty of the position. For the moment, he sought refuge in retreat and left the room precipitately. Dorcas brought in fresh tea. As she left the room, Perrault came over from the window where he had been standing and sat down facing Miss Howard. "Mademoiselle," he said gravely, "I want to ask you something." Ask away, said the lady, eyeing him with some disfavor. I want to be able to count upon your help. I'll help you hang Alfred with pleasure, she replied gruffly. Hanging's too good for him. Ought to be drawn and quartered like in good old times. We are at one then, said Perrault, for I too want to hang the criminal. Alfred Inglethorpe? Him? Or another? No question of another. Poor Emily was never murdered until he came along. I don't say she wasn't surrounded by sharks. She was. But it was only her purse they were after. Her life was safe enough. But along comes Mr. Alfred Inglethorpe, and within 2 months, hey presto! Believe me, Miss Howard, said Perrault very earnestly, if Mr. Inglethorpe is the man, he shall not escape me. On my honor, I will hang him as high as Haman. That's better, said Miss Howard more enthusiastically. But I must ask you to trust me. Now your help may be very valuable to me. I will tell you why. Because in all this house of mourning, yours are the only eyes that have wept. Miss Howard blinked, and a new note crept into the gruffness of her voice. If you mean that I was fond of her, yes, I was. You know, Emily was a selfish old woman in her way. She was very generous, but she always wanted a return. She never let people forget what she had done for them, and that way she missed love. Don't think she ever realized it, though, or felt the lack of it. Hope not, anyway. I was on a different footing. I took my stand from the first. So many pounds a year I'm worth to you, well and good, but not a penny piece besides, not a pair of gloves nor a theater ticket. She didn't understand, was very offended sometimes, said I was foolishly proud. It wasn't that, but I couldn't explain. Anyway, I kept my self-respect. And so, out of the whole bunch, I was the only one who could allow myself to be fond of her. I watched over her, I guarded her from the lot of them, and then a glib-tongued scoundrel comes along, and pooh, all my years of devotion go for nothing. Perrault nodded sympathetically. I understand, mademoiselle. I understand all you feel. It is most natural. You think that we are lukewarm, that we lack fire and energy. But trust me, it is not so. John stuck his head in at this juncture and invited us both to come up to Mrs. Inglethorpe's room, as he and Mr. Wells had finished looking through the desk in the boudoir. As we went up the stairs, John looked back into the dining room door and lowered his voice confidentially. Look here, what's going to happen when these two meet? I shook my head helplessly. I've told Mary to keep them apart if she can. Will she be able to do so? The Lord only knows. There's one thing. Inglethorpe himself won't be too keen on meeting her. You've got the keys still, haven't you, Perrault? I asked, as we reached the door of the locked room. Taking the keys from Perrault, John unlocked it, and we all passed in. The lawyer went straight to the desk, and John followed him. My mother kept most of her important papers in this dispatch case, I believe, he said. Perrault drew out the small bunch of keys. Permit me. I locked it out of precaution this morning. But it's not locked now. Impossible. See? And John lifted the lid as he spoke. Mi tonnerre. Okay. I don't actually know how to pronounce that one. Mie tonnerres, or something like that, cried Perrault, dumbfounded. And I, who have both the keys in my pocket. He flung himself upon the case. Suddenly he stiffened. Et voilà, une affaire. This lock has been forced. What? Perrault laid down the case again. But who forced it? Why should they? When? But the door was locked. These exclamations burst from us disjointedly. Perrault answered them categorically, almost mechanically. Who? That is the question. Why? Ah, if only I knew. When? Since I was here an hour ago. As to the door being locked, it is a very ordinary lock. Probably any other of the door keys in this passage would fit it. We stared at one another blankly. Perrault had walked over to the mantelpiece. He was outwardly calm, but I noticed his hands, which from long force of habit were mechanically straightening the spill vases on the mantelpiece, were shaking violently. See here, it was like this, he said at last. There was something in that case. Some piece of evidence, slight in itself perhaps, but still enough of a clue to connect the murderer with the crime. It was vital to him that it should be destroyed before it was discovered and its significance appreciated. Therefore, he took the risk, the great risk, of coming in here. Finding the case locked, he was obliged to force it, thus betraying his presence. For him to take that risk, it must have been something of great importance. But what was it? Ah, cried Poirot, with a gesture of anger, that I do not know. A document of some kind, without doubt. Possibly the scrap of paper Dorcas saw in her hand yesterday afternoon. And I, his anger burst forth freely, miserable animal that I am, I guessed nothing. I behaved like an imbecile. I should never have left that case here. I should have carried it away with me. Ah, triple pig! And now it is gone. It is destroyed. But is it destroyed? Is there not yet a chance? We must leave no stone unturned. He rushed like a madman from the room, and I followed him as soon as I had sufficiently recovered my wits. But by the time I had reached the top of the stairs, he was out of sight. Mary Cavendish was standing where the staircase branched, staring down into the hall in the direction in which he had disappeared. What has happened to your extraordinary little friend, Mr. Hastings? He has just rushed past me like a mad bull. He's rather upset about something, I remarked feebly. I really did not know how much Poirot would wish me to disclose. As I saw a faint smile gather on Mrs. Cavendish's expressive mouth, I endeavored to try and turn the conversation by saying, "They haven't met yet, have they?" "Who?" "Mr. Inglethorpe and Miss Howard." She looked at me in rather a disconcerting manner. "Do you think it would be such a disaster if they did meet?" "Well, don't you?" I said, rather taken aback. "No." She was smiling in her quiet way. "I should like to see a good flare-up. It would clear the air. At present, we are all thinking so much and saying so little." "John doesn't think so," I said. "He's anxious to keep them apart." "Oh, John!" Something in her tone fired me, and I blurted out, "Old John's an awfully good sort." She studied me curiously for a minute or two, and then said, to my great surprise, "You are loyal to your friend. I like you for that." "Aren't you my friend, too?" "I am a very bad friend." "Why do you say that?" "Because it is true. I am charming to my friends one day, and forget all about them the next." I don't know what impelled me, but I was nettled, and I said foolishly and not in the best of taste, "Yet you seem to be invariably charming to Dr. Bauerstein." Instantly, I regretted my words. Her face stiffened. I had the impression of a steel curtain coming down and blotting out the real woman. Without a word, she turned and went swiftly up the stairs, whilst I stood like an idiot, gaping after her. I was recalled to other matters by a frightful row going on below. I could hear Poirot shouting and expounding. I was vexed to think that my diplomacy had been in vain. The little man appeared to be taking the whole house into his confidence, a proceeding of which I, for one, doubted the wisdom. Once again, I could not help regretting that my friend was so prone to lose his head in moments of excitement. I stepped briskly down the stairs. The sight of me calmed Poirot almost immediately. I drew him aside. "My dear fellow," I said, "is this wise? Surely you don't want the whole house to know of this occurrence. You are actually playing into the criminal's hands." "You think so, Hastings?" "I am sure of it." "Well, well, my friend, I will be guided by you." "Good, although unfortunately it is a little too late now." "Sure." He looked so crestfallen and abashed that I felt quite sorry, though I still thought my rebuke a just and wise one. "Well," he said at last, "let us go, mon ami." "You've finished here?" "For the moment, yes. You will walk back with me to the village?" "Willingly." He picked up his little suitcase, and we went out through the open window in the drawing-room. Cynthia Murdoch was just coming in, and Poirot stood aside to let her pass. "Excuse me, mademoiselle, one moment." "Yes," she turned inquiringly. "Did you ever make up Mrs. Inglethorpe's medicines?" A slight flush rose in her face, as she answered rather constrainedly, "No." Only her powders? The flush deepened as Cynthia replied, "Oh, yes, I did make up some sleeping powders for her once." "These?" Perrault produced the empty box which had contained powders. She nodded. "Can you tell me what they were? Sulfonal? Veronal?" "No, they were bromide powders." "Ah, thank you, mademoiselle. Good morning." As we walked briskly away from the house, I glanced at him more than once. I had often before noticed that if anything excited him, his eyes turned green like a cat's. They were shining like emeralds now. "My friend," he broke out at last, "I have a little idea, a very strange and probably utterly impossible idea, and yet it fits in." I shrugged my shoulders. I privately thought that Perrault was rather too much given to these fantastic ideas. In this case, surely, the truth was only too plain and apparent. "So that is the explanation of the blank label on the box," I remarked. "Very simple, as you said. I really wonder that I did not think of it myself." Perrault did not appear to be listening to me. "They have made one more discovery, là-bas," he observed, jerking his thumb over his shoulder in the direction of Styles. "Mr. Wells told me as we were going upstairs." "What was it?" "Locked up in the desk in the boudoir, they found a will of Mrs. Inglethorpe's, dated before her marriage, leaving her fortune to Alfred Inglethorpe. It must have been made just at the time they were engaged. It came quite as a surprise to Wells, and to John Cavendish also. It was written on one of those printed will forms, and witnessed by two of the servants, not Dorcas." "Did Mr. Inglethorpe know of it?" "He says not." "One might take that with a grain of salt," I remarked skeptically. "All these wills are very confusing. Tell me, how did those scribbled words on the envelope help you to discover that a will was made yesterday afternoon?" Perrault smiled. "Mon ami, have you ever, when writing a letter, been arrested by the fact that you did not know how to spell a certain word?" "Yes, often. I suppose everyone has." "Exactly. And have you not, in such a case, tried the word once or twice on the edge of the blotting paper, or a spare scrap of paper, to see if it looked right? Well, that is what Mrs. Inglethorpe did. You will notice that the word possessed is spelt first with one S, and subsequently with two correctly. To make sure, she had further tried it in a sentence, thus, 'I am possessed.' Now, what did that tell me? It told me that Mrs. Inglethorpe had been writing the word possessed that afternoon, and, having the fragment of paper found in the grate fresh in my mind, the possibility of a will, a document almost certain to contain that word, occurred to me at once. This possibility was conferred by a further circumstance. In the general confusion, the boudoir had not been swept that morning, and near the desk were several traces of brown mold and earth. The weather had been perfectly fine for some days, and no ordinary boots would have left such a heavy deposit. I strolled to the window, and saw at once that the begonia beds had been newly planted. The mold in the beds was exactly similar to that on the floor of the boudoir, and also I learnt from you that they had been planted yesterday afternoon. I was now sure that one, or possibly both of the gardeners, for there were two sets of footprints in the bed, had entered the boudoir, for if Mrs. Inglethorpe had merely wished to speak to them, she would, in all probability, have stood at the window, and they would not have come into the room at all. I was now quite convinced that she had made a fresh will, and had called the two gardeners in to witness her signature. Events proved that I was right in my supposition. That was very ingenious, I could not help admitting. I must confess that the conclusions I drew from those few scribbled words were quite erroneous. He smiled. You gave too much rein to your imagination. Imagination is a good servant and a bad master. The simplest explanation is always the most likely. Another point. How did you know that the key of the dispatch case had been lost? I did not know it. It was a guess that turned out to be correct. You observed that it had a piece of twisted wire through the handle. That suggested to me at once that it had possibly been wrenched off a flimsy keyring. Now, if it had been lost and recovered, Mrs. Inglethorpe would at once have replaced it on her bunch. but on her bunch I found what was obviously the duplicate key, very new and bright, which led me to the hypothesis that somebody else had inserted the original key in the lock of the dispatch case. Yes, I said. Alfred Inglethorpe, without doubt. Poirot looked at me curiously. You are very sure of his guilt? Well, naturally. Every fresh circumstance seems to establish it more clearly. On the contrary, said Poirot quietly, there are several points in his favor. Oh, come now. Yes, I see only one. And that he was not in the house last night. Bad shot, as you English say. You have chosen the one point that, to my mind, tells against him. How is that? Because if Mr. Inglethorpe knew that his wife would be poisoned last night, he would certainly have arranged to be away from the house. His excuse was an obviously trumped-up one. That leaves us two possibilities. Either he knew what was going to happen, or he had a reason of his own for his absence. And that reason? I asked skeptically. Poirot shrugged his shoulders. How should I know? Discreditable without doubt. This Mr. Inglethorpe, I should say, is somewhat of a scoundrel, but that does not of necessity make him a murderer. I shook my head, unconvinced. We do not agree, eh? Said Poirot. Well, let us leave it. Time will show which of us is right. Now, let us turn to other aspects of the case. What do you make of the fact that all the doors of the bedroom were bolted on the inside? Well, I considered, one must look at it logically. True. I should put it this way. The doors were bolted. Our own eyes have told us that. Yet the presence of the candle grease on the floor and the destruction of the will prove that during the night someone entered the room. You agree so far? Perfectly. Put with admirable clearness. Proceed. Well, I said, encouraged, as the person who did not do so by the window, nor by miraculous means, it follows that the door must have been opened from inside by Mrs. Inglethorpe herself. That strengthens the conviction that the person in question was her husband. Stooping the gypsy? Maybe. She would naturally open the door to her own husband. Poirot shook his head. Why should she? She had bolted the door leading into his room, a most unusual proceeding on her part. She had had a most violent quarrel with him that very afternoon. No, he was the last person she would admit. But you agree with me that the door must have been opened by Mrs. Inglethorpe herself. There is another possibility. She may have forgotten to bolt the door into the passage when she went to bed, and have got up later, towards morning, and bolted it then. Poirot, is that seriously your opinion? No, I do not say it is so, but it might be. Now, to turn to another feature, what do you make of the scrap of conversation you overheard between Mrs. Cavendish and her mother-in-law? I'd forgotten that, I said thoughtfully. That is as enigmatical as ever. It seems incredible that a woman like Mrs. Cavendish, proud and reticent to the last degree, should interfere so violently in what was certainly not her affair. Precisely. It was an astonishing thing for a woman of her breeding to do. It is certainly curious, I agreed. Still, it is unimportant and need not be taken into account. A groan burst from Poirot. What have I always told you? Everything must be taken into account. If the fact will not fit the theory, let the theory go. Well, we shall see, I said, nettled. Yes, we shall see. We had reached Leastways Cottage, and Poirot ushered me upstairs to his own room. He offered me one of the tiny Russian cigarettes he himself occasionally smoked. I was amused to notice that he stowed away the used matches most carefully in a little china pot. My momentary annoyance vanished. Poirot had placed our 2 chairs in front of the open window, which commanded a view of the village street. The fresh air blew in warm and pleasant. It was going to be a hot day. Suddenly, my attention was arrested by a weedy-looking young man rushing down the street at a great pace. It was the expression on his face that was extraordinary, a curious mingling of terror and agitation. "Look, Perrault," I said. He leant forward. "Tiens," he said, "it is Mr. Mace from the chemist's shop. He is coming here." The young man came to a halt before Leastways' cottage, and after hesitating a moment, pounded vigorously at the door. "A little minute," cried Perrault from the window. "I come." Motioning to me to follow him, he ran swiftly down the stairs and opened the door. Mr. Mace began at once. "Oh, Mr. Perrault, I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but I heard that you'd just come back from the hall." "Yes, we have." The young man moistened his dry lips. His face was working curiously. "It's all over the village about old Mrs. Inglethorpe dying so suddenly. They do say," he lowered his voice cautiously, "that it's poison." Perrault's face remained quite impassive. "Only the doctors can tell us that, Mr. Mace." "Yes, of course." The young man hesitated, and then his agitation was just too much for him. He clutched Perrault by the arm and sank his voice to a whisper. "Just tell me this, Mr. Perrault. It isn't strychnine, is it?" I hardly heard what Perrault replied. Something, evidently of a non-committal nature. The young man departed, and as he closed the door, Perrault's eyes met mine. "Yes," he said, nodding gravely. "He will have evidence to give at the inquest." We went slowly upstairs again. I was opening my lips when Perrault stopped me with a gesture of his hand. Not now, mon ami. I have need of reflection. My mind is in some disorder, which is not well." For about 10 minutes he sat in dead silence, perfectly still, except for several expressive motions of his eyebrows, and all the time his eyes grew steadily greener. At last he heaved a deep sigh. "It is well. The bad moment has passed. Now all is arranged and classified. One must never permit confusion. The case is not clear yet, no, for it is of the most complicated. It puzzles me, Hercule Poirot. There are 2 facts of significance." "And what are they?" "The first is the state of the weather yesterday. That is very important." "But it was a glorious day," I interrupted. "Poirot, you're pulling my leg." "Not at all. The thermometer registered 80 degrees in the shade. Do not forget that, my friend. It is the key to the whole riddle." "And the second point?" I asked. "The important fact that Monsieur Inglethorpe wears very peculiar clothes, has a black beard, and uses glasses." "Perrault, I cannot believe you are serious." "I am absolutely serious, my friend." "But this is childish." "No, it is very momentous." "And supposing the coroner's jury returns a verdict of willful murder against Alfred Inglethorpe, what becomes of your theories then?" "They would not be shaken because 12 stupid men had happened to make a mistake. But that will not occur. For one thing, a country jury is not anxious to take responsibility upon itself, and Mr. Inglethorpe stands practically in the position of local squire. Also," he added placidly, "I should not allow it." "You would not allow it?" "No." I looked at the extraordinary little man, divided between annoyance and amusement. He was so tremendously sure of himself. As though he read my thoughts, he nodded gently. "Oh yes, mon ami, I would do what I say." He got up and laid his hand on my shoulder. His physiognomy underwent a complete change. Tears came into his eyes. "In all this, you see, I think of that poor Mrs. Inglethorpe who is dead. She was not extravagantly loved, no, but she was very good to us Belgians. I owe her a debt." I endeavored to interrupt, but Perrault swept on. "Let me tell you this, Hastings. She would never forgive me if I let Alfred Inglethorpe, her husband, be arrested now when a word from me could save him." All right, let's take a short intermission, and then we'll come back to it, and we'll take another crack at the poll and see if anyways, changed their mind on who the guilty party is. And I've got a handy new timer for when we'll be back. And there it is. Excellent. So we'll start again in just under 5 minutes. Hey, Dakotan. Welcome. Glad you could make it. How are you today? Just fireworks? Right on. Well, I'm glad you could join us, and thank you for spreading the word, Vela. I really appreciate that. It's the best way to help expand the audience. Seem to get quite a few offline viewers, but I think we haven't quite nailed a good time slot yet for live listeners. I know that the first section of Agatha Christie got 70 people viewing it after the stream on the recording, which is huge right now and awesome. And speaking of which, all you wonderful people that are listening now and will listen later, if you're enjoying this, please, please, please click that purple follow button. It is so important and it helps out so much. And it'll unlock additional capabilities for the stream once we hit the next milestone, which is 50 followers. We're actually getting really close to that. It's only been a little over a week that I've been streaming, and we're already at, I think, 33 followers now, which is just amazing. I am so flattered and so humbled, guys. I really appreciate all of you that have followed so far. So average viewers for live streams is about 4.74 right now, according to the analytics. I've had as many as, I think, 14 live viewers and as few as, well, 2. But the offline viewers, when I post the recordings, I'm getting about 50 views on each of the recordings, and then 70 on the first part of the Agatha Christie novel, which is huge. It's awesome. I'm absolutely delighted by that. Yep. And once we hit affiliate, we'll be able to integrate the channel with the Discord that I'm building for this, and we'll be able to have more like interaction with the community and some feedback. And I'm hoping to actually be able to discuss some of the readings with you guys that are listening, both live and offline listeners. I've been kind of chomping at the bit to discuss, theories on who the killer is and that sort of thing, which I suppose by this point I can definitely do it on stream without giving anything away. So one of the things I noticed was what Perot just pointed out, was the unusual attire and facial characteristics of Mr. Alfred Inglethorpe. And the comment was even made that he looked like somebody that belonged on a stage. So it's almost like they're saying that he's wearing a costume and makeup and a false beard and everything to disguise his true identity. You think he's a gypsy? I don't know. There's somebody else that has kind of a Clark Kent Superman relationship with him. I don't believe we have seen Lawrence and Alfred in the same room at the same time yet. And Lawrence is the only other person whose facial features and beard were really focused on by the author. They went to great lengths to mention how extraordinarily clean-shaven he was. Kind of like somebody who had to keep his face cleaned off so that the glue of a false beard would have an easier time sticking. Also, lest anyone get creeped out, remember these are stepsons, so there's no blood relation, and they made a point of talking about blood relation and the lack of it between John Lawrence and Mrs. Inglethorpe, and how blood will tell, as it were. So there's no blood relation there either. I believe Lawrence is also quite a bit younger than Alfred Inglethorpe's assumed age, so I suspect that that might account for Mr. Inglethorpe stepping out with the gypsy girl. I suspect that there was no physical love in this relationship in any case. They maintained separate bedrooms, which it was also mentioned that Alfred's bedroom wasn't really slept in. And he seemed to act more like a caregiver or even a nurse when he was interacting with Emily Inglethorpe. I don't recall them actually talking about any embraces or kisses or anything of the sort, even so much as a kiss on the cheek. But they did talk about him being solicitous and like propping her up with pillows and that sort of thing, or fetching her tea and whatnot. So I suspect that Lawrence and Alfred may be one and the same. I could be completely off base, but that's my suspicion. What do you guys think? I mean, fair point, but what would John have to gain? I mean, because of the marriage, he wasn't going to be able to inherit. Okay. Well, you'll have to check out the first chapter when you get a chance. But our timer's run down, so I suppose we should rejoin the story. Ah, yes, that's true. Um, if you are listening but muted, it doesn't actually count as a view for Twitch. So, then again, I really want to have like real views, right? And real followers. I don't want people I don't want people following who aren't actually enjoying it and genuinely wanting to follow. I don't like the whole follow for follow thing, and I don't like the like follow farming that people do. I want to be able to look at that number and know that's people who actually like and appreciate what I'm doing. And I'm hoping to get more interaction and more feedback with the people that do watch, because I'm new to this and I know there's a ton I could do to improve it. So I want to be able to get feedback on what people would like to see or hear, what things that I'm doing they like, what maybe they don't like, that kind of thing. So in any case, let's return to the story. And for those of you who are watching offline, if you haven't followed yet, please do just drop down and click that purple follow button. As I've said, it's so important and so helpful, but only if you are actually enjoying this and want to see this community succeed. If you are not, if it's not your cup of tea, that's fine. There'll be something else out there for you, and I appreciate you stopping in to look. But if you are enjoying it, please do click follow. And when I open up the Discord, please jump in and participate, say hello, and give me any feedback you might have. I also do take reading requests. There's a stream that I did yesterday by request. We started one of the Conan stories. So, Chapter 6, The Inquest. In the interval before the inquest, Poirot was unfailing in his activity. Twice he was closeted with Mr. Wells. He also took long walks into the country. I rather resented his not taking me into his confidence, the more so as I could not in the least guess what he was driving at. It occurred to me that he might have been making inquiries at Rake's farm. So, finding him out when I called at Leastways Cottage on Wednesday evening, I walked over there by the fields, hoping to meet him. But there was no sign of him, and I hesitated to go right up to the farm itself. As I walked away, I met an aged rustic who leered at me cunningly. "You'm from the Hall, bain't you?" he asked. "Yes, I'm looking for a friend of mine whom I thought might have walked this way." "A little chap, as waves his hands when he talks, one of them Belgies from the village." "Yes," I said eagerly. "He's been here, then?" "Oh, aye, he's been here, right enough. More than once, too. Friend of yours, is he? Ah, you gentlemen from the Hall, you'm a pretty lot." And he leered more jocosely than ever. "Why, do the gentlemen from the Hall come here often?" I asked, as carelessly as I could. He winked at me knowingly. "One does, mister. Naming no names, mind. And a very liberal gentleman, too." Oh, thank you, sir, I'm sure." I walked on sharply. Evelyn Howard had been right then, and I experienced a sharp twinge of disgust as I thought of Alfred Inglethorpe's liberality with another woman's money. Had that piquant gypsy face been at the bottom of the crime, or was it the baser mainspring of money? Probably a judicious mixture of both. On one point, Poirot seemed to have a curious obsession. He once or twice observed to me that he thought Dorcas must have made an error in fixing the time of the quarrel. He suggested to her repeatedly that it was 4:30 and not 4 o'clock when she had heard the voices. But Dorcas was unshaken. Quite an hour or even more had elapsed between the time when she had heard the voices and 5 o'clock, when she had taken tea to her mistress. The inquest was held on Friday at the Stylites Arms in the village. Poirot and I sat together, not being required to give evidence. The preliminaries were gone through. The jury viewed the body, and John Cavendish gave evidence of identification. Further questioned, he described his awakening in the early hours of the morning and the circumstances of his mother's death. The medical evidence was next taken. There was a breathless hush, and every eye was fixed on the famous London specialist, who was known to be one of the greatest authorities of the day on the subject of toxicology. In a few brief words, he summed up the results of the post-mortem. Shorn of its medical phraseology and technicalities, it amounted to the fact that Mrs. Inglethorpe had met her death as the result of strychnine poisoning. Judging from the quantity recovered, she must have taken not less than 3/4 of a grain of strychnine, but probably 1 grain or slightly over. "Is it possible that she could have swallowed the poison by accident?" asked the coroner. "I should consider it very unlikely. Strychnine is not used for domestic purposes, as some poisons are, and there are restrictions placed on its sale." "Does anything in your examination lead you to determine how the poison was administered?" "No." "You arrived at Styles before Dr. Wilkins, I believe." "That is so. The motor met me just outside the lodge gates, and I hurried there as fast as I could." "Will you relate to us exactly what happened next?" "I entered Mrs. Inglethorpe's room. She was at that moment in a typical tetanic convulsion. She turned towards me and gasped out, 'Alfred! Alfred!' Could the strychnine have been administered in Mrs. Inglethorpe's after-dinner coffee, which was taken to her by her husband?" "Possibly. But strychnine is a fairly rapid drug in its action. The symptoms appear from 1 to 2 hours after it has been swallowed. It is retarded under certain conditions, none of which, however, appear to have been present in this case. I presume Mrs. Inglethorpe took the coffee after dinner about 8 o'clock, whereas the symptoms did not manifest themselves until the early hours of the morning, which, on the face of it, points to the drug having been taken much later in the evening." Mrs. Inglethorpe was in the habit of drinking a cup of cocoa in the middle of the night. Could the strychnine have been administered in that? No. I myself took a sample of the cocoa remaining in the saucepan and had it analyzed. There was no strychnine present. I heard Perrault chuckle softly beside me. How did you know? I whispered. Listen. I should say, the doctor was continuing, that I would have been considerably surprised at any other result. Why? Simply because strychnine has an unusually bitter taste. It can be detected in a solution of 1 in 70,000 and can only be disguised by some strongly flavored substance. Cocoa would be quite powerless to mask it. One of the jury wanted to know if the same objection applied to coffee. No. Coffee has a bitter taste of its own, which would probably cover the taste of strychnine. Then you consider it more likely that the drug was administered in the coffee, but that, for some unknown reason, its action was delayed. Yes, but, the cup being completely smashed, there is no possibility of analyzing its contents. This concluded Dr. Bauerstein's evidence. Dr. Wilkins corroborated it on all points. Sounded as to the possibility of suicide, he repudiated it utterly. The deceased, he said, suffered from a weak heart, but otherwise enjoyed perfect health and was of a cheerful and well-balanced disposition. She would be one of the last people to take her own life. Lawrence Cavendish was next called. His evidence was quite unimportant, being a mere repetition of that of his brother. Just as he was about to step down, he paused and said rather hesitantly, I should like to make a suggestion, if I may. He glanced deprecatingly at the coroner, who replied briskly, Certainly, Mr. Cavendish. We are here to arrive at the truth of this matter, and welcome anything that may lead to further elucidation. It is just an idea of mine, explained Lawrence. Of course, I may be quite wrong, but it still seems to me that my mother's death might be accounted for by natural means. How do you make that out, Mr. Cavendish? My mother, at the time of her death and for some time before it, was taking a tonic containing strychnine. Ah, said the coroner. The jury looked up interested. I believe, continued Lawrence, that there have been cases where the cumulative effect of a drug, administered for some time, has ended by causing death. Also, is it not possible that she may have taken an overdose of her own medicine by accident? This is the first we have heard of the deceased taking strychnine at the time of her death. We are very much obliged to you, Mr. Cavendish. Dr. Wilkins was recalled and ridiculed the idea. What Mr. Cavendish suggests is quite impossible. Any doctor would tell you the same. Strychnine is, in a certain sense, a cumulative poison, but it would be quite impossible for it to result in sudden death in this way. There would have to be a long period of chronic symptoms which would at once have attracted my attention. The whole thing is absurd. And the second suggestion? That Mrs. Inglethorpe may have inadvertently taken an overdose? 3 or even 4 doses would not have resulted in death. Mrs. Inglethorpe always had an extra large amount of medicine made up at the time, as she dealt with Coots, the cash chemist in Tadminster. She would have had to take very nearly the whole bottle to account for the amount of strychnine found at the post-mortem. Then you consider that we may dismiss the tonic as not being in any way instrumental in causing her death. Certainly. The supposition is ridiculous. The same juryman who had interrupted before here suggested that the chemist who made up the medicine might have committed an error. That, of course, is always possible, replied the doctor. But Dorcas, who was the next witness called, dispelled even that possibility. The medicine had not been newly made up. On the contrary, Mrs. Inglethorpe had taken the last dose on the day of her death. So the question of the tonic was finally abandoned, and coroner proceeded with his task. Having elicited from Dorcas how she had been awakened by the violent ringing of her mistress's bell, and had subsequently roused the household, he passed to the subject of the quarrel on the preceding afternoon. Dorcas' evidence on this point was substantially what Perrault and I had already heard, so I will not repeat it here. The next witness was Mary Cavendish. She stood very upright and spoke in a low, clear, and perfectly composed voice. In answer to the coroner's question, she told how, her alarm clock having aroused her at 4:30 as usual, she was dressing when she was startled by the sound of something heavy falling. That would have been the table by the bed, commented the coroner. I opened my door, continued Mary, and listened. In a few minutes, a bell rang violently. Dorcas came running down and woke my husband, and we all went to my mother-in-law's room, but it was locked. The coroner interrupted her. I really do not think we need to trouble you further on that point. We know all that can be known of the subsequent happenings, but I should be obliged if you would tell us all you overheard of the quarrel the day before. I? There was a faint insolence in her voice. She raised her hand and adjusted the ruffle of lace at her neck, turning her head a little as she did so. And quite spontaneously the thought flashed across my mind. She is gaining time. Yes, I understand, continued the coroner deliberately, that you were sitting reading on the bench just outside the long window of the boudoir. That is so, is it not? This was news to me, and glancing sideways at Perrault, I fancied that it was news to him as well. There was the faintest pause, the mere hesitation of a moment, before she answered, Yes, that is so. And the boudoir window was open, was it not? Surely her face grew a little paler as she answered, Yes. Then you cannot have failed to hear the voices inside, especially as they were raised in anger. In fact, they would be more audible where you were than in the hall. Possibly. Will you repeat to us what you overheard of the quarrel? I really do not remember hearing anything. Do you mean to say that you did not hear voices? Oh, yes, I heard the voices, but I did not hear what they said. A faint spot of color came into her cheek. I am not in the habit of listening to private conversations. And you remember nothing at all? Nothing, Mrs. Cavendish? Not one stray word or phrase to make you realize that it was a private conversation? She paused and seemed to reflect, still outwardly as calm as ever. Yes, I remember. Mrs. Inglethorpe said something, I do not remember exactly what, about causing scandal between husband and wife. Ah, the coroner leant back satisfied. That corresponds with what Dorcas heard. But, excuse me, Mrs. Cavendish, although you realized it was a private conversation, you did not move away? You remained where you were? I caught the momentary gleam of her tawny eyes as she raised them. I felt certain that at that moment she would willingly have torn the little lawyer, with his insinuations, into pieces. But she replied quietly enough, No, I was very comfortable where I was. I fixed my mind on my book. And that is all you can tell us? That is all. The examination was over, though I doubted if the coroner was entirely satisfied with it. I think he suspected that Mary Cavendish could tell more if she chose. Amy Hill, shop assistant, was next called, and deposed to having sold a will form on the afternoon of the 17th to William Earle, undergardener at Styles. William Earle and Manning succeeded her, and testified to witnessing a document. Manning fixed the time at about 4:30. William was of the opinion that it was rather earlier. Cynthia Murdoch came next. She had, however, little to tell. She had known nothing of the tragedy until awakened by Mrs. Cavendish. You did not hear the table fall? No, I was fast asleep. The coroner smiled. A good conscience makes a sound sleeper, he observed. Thank you, Miss Murdoch. That is all. Miss Howard. Miss Howard produced the letter written to her by Mrs. Inglethorpe on the evening of the 17th. Perrault and I had, of course, already seen it. It added nothing to our knowledge of the tragedy. The following is a facsimile. Styles Court, Essex. Handwritten note. July 17th. My dear Evelyn, can we not bury the hatchet? I have found it hard to forgive the things you said against my dear husband, but I am an old woman and very fond of you. Yours affectionately, Emily Inglethorpe. It was handed to the jury, who scrutinized it attentively. I fear it does not help us much, said the coroner with a sigh. There is no mention of any of the events of that afternoon. Plain as a pikestaff to me, said Miss Howard shortly. It shows clearly enough that my poor old friend had just found out she'd been made a fool of. It says nothing of the kind in the letter, the coroner pointed out. No, because Emily never could bear to put herself in the wrong. But I know her. She wanted me back, but she wasn't going to own that I'd been right. She went round about. Most people do. Don't believe in it myself. Mr. Wells smiled faintly. So, I noticed, did several of the jury. Miss Howard was obviously quite a public character. Anyway, all this tomfoolery is a great waste of time, continued the lady, glancing up and down the jury disparagingly. Talk, 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 when all the time we know perfectly well. The coroner interrupted her in an agony of apprehension. Thank you, Miss Howard, that is all. I fancy he breathed a sigh of relief when she complied. Then came the sensation of the day. The coroner called Albert Mace, chemist's assistant. It was our agitated young man of the pale face. In answer to the coroner's questions, he explained that he was a qualified pharmacist, but had only recently come to this particular shop, as the assistant formerly there had just been called up for the army. These preliminaries completed, the coroner proceeded to business. Mr. Mace, have you lately sold strychnine to any unauthorized person? Yes, sir. When was this? Last Monday night. Monday? Not Tuesday? No, sir. Monday the 16th. Will you tell us to whom you sold it? You could have heard a pin drop. Yes, sir. It was to Mr. Inglethorpe. Every eye turned simultaneously to where Alfred Inglethorpe was sitting, impassive and wooden. He started slightly as the damning words fell from the young man's lips. I half thought he was going to rise from his chair, but he remained seated, although a remarkably well-acted expression of astonishment rose on his face. You are sure of what you say? Asked the coroner sternly. Quite sure, sir. Are you in the habit of selling strychnine indiscriminately over the counter? The wretched young man wilted visibly under the coroner's frown. Oh, no, sir, of course not, but seeing it was Mr. Inglethorpe of the Hall, I thought there was no harm in it. He said it was to poison a dog. Inwardly I sympathized. It was only human nature to endeavor to please the Hall, especially when it might result in custom being transferred from Coots to the local establishment. Is it not customary for anyone purchasing poison to sign a book? Yes, sir. Mr. Inglethorpe did so. Have you got the book here? Yes, sir. It was produced, and with a few words of stern censure, the coroner dismissed the wretched Mr. Mace. Then, amidst a breathless silence, Alfred Inglethorpe was called. Did he realize, I wondered, how closely the halter was being drawn around his neck? The coroner went straight to the point. On Monday evening last, did you purchase strychnine for the purpose of poisoning a dog? Inglethorpe replied with perfect calmness. No, I did not. There is no dog at Styles, except an outdoor sheepdog, which is in perfect health. You deny absolutely having purchased strychnine from Albert Mace on Monday last? I do. Do you also deny this? The coroner handed him the register in which his signature was inscribed. Certainly I do. The handwriting is quite different from mine. I will show you. He took an old envelope out of his pocket and wrote his name on it, handing it to the jury. It was certainly utterly dissimilar. Then what is your explanation of Mr. Mace's statement? Alfred Inglethorpe replied imperturbably. Mr. Mace must have been mistaken. The coroner hesitated for a moment and then said, Mr. Inglethorpe, as a mere matter of form, would you mind telling us where you were on the evening of Monday, July 16th? Really, I cannot remember. That is absurd, Mr. Inglethorpe, said the coroner sharply. Think again. Inglethorpe shook his head. I cannot tell you. I have an idea that I was out walking. In what direction? I really can't remember. The coroner's face grew graver. Were you in the company with anyone? No. Did you meet anyone on your walk? No. That is a pity, said the coroner dryly. I am to take it, then, that you decline to say where you were at the time that Mr. Mace positively recognized you as entering the shop to purchase strychnine. If you like to take it that way, yes. Be careful, Mr. Inglethorpe. Perrault was fidgeting nervously. Sacré, he murmured. Does this imbecile of a man want to be arrested? Inglethorpe was indeed creating a bad impression. His futile denials would not have convinced a child. The coroner, however, passed briskly to the next point, and Perrault drew a deep breath of relief. You had a discussion with your wife on Tuesday afternoon. Pardon me, interrupted Alfred Inglethorpe. You have been been misinformed. I had no quarrel with my dear wife. The whole story is absolutely untrue. I was absent from the house the entire afternoon. Have you anyone who can testify to that? You have my word, said Inglethorpe haughtily. The coroner did not trouble to reply. There are 2 witnesses who will swear to having heard your disagreement with Mrs. Inglethorpe. Those witnesses were mistaken. I was puzzled. The man spoke with such quiet assurance that I was staggered. I looked at Perrault. There was an expression of exultation on his face, which I could not understand. Was he at last convinced of Alfred Inglethorpe's guilt? Mr. Inglethorpe, said the coroner, you have heard your wife's dying words repeated here. Can you explain them in any way? Certainly I can. You can? It seems to me very simple. The room was dimly lighted. Dr. Bauerstein is much of my height and build, and like me wears a beard. In the dim light, and suffering as she was, my poor wife mistook him for me. Ah, murmured Perrault to himself, but it is an idea, that. You think it is true, I whispered. I do not say that, but it is truly an ingenious supposition. You read my wife's last words as an accusation, Inglethorpe was continuing. They were, on the contrary, an appeal to me. The coroner reflected a moment. Then he said, I believe, Mr. Inglethorpe, that you yourself poured out the coffee and took it to your wife that evening. I poured it out, yes, but I did not take it to her. I meant to do so, but I was told that a friend was at the hall door, so I laid down the coffee on the hall table. When I came through the hall a few minutes later, it was gone. This statement might or might not be true, but it did not seem to me to improve matters much for Inglethorpe. In any case, he had had ample time to introduce the poison. At that point, Perrault nudged me gently, indicating 2 men who were sitting together near the door. One was a little, sharp, dark, ferret-faced man. The other was tall and fair. I questioned Perrault mutely. He put his lips to my ear. Do you know who that little man is? I shook my head. That is Detective Inspector James Japp of Scotland Yard. Jimmy Japp. The other man is from Scotland Yard, too. Things are moving quickly, my friend. I stared at the 2 men intently. There was certainly nothing of the policeman about them. I should never have suspected them of being official personages. I was still staring when I was startled and recalled by the verdict being given. Willful murder against some person or persons unknown. Chapter 7. Perrault pays his debts. As we come out of the Stylite's arms, Perrault drew me aside by a gentle pressure of the arm. I understood his object. He was waiting for the Scotland Yard men. In a few moments they emerged, and Perrault at once stepped forward and accosted the shorter of the 2. I fear you do not remember me, Inspector Japp. Why, if it isn't Mr. Perrault, cried the inspector. He turned to the other man. You've heard me speak of Mr. Perrault. It was in 1904. He and I worked together. The Abercrombie forgery case, you remember. He was run down in Brussels. Ah, those were great days, monsieur. Then, do you remember Baron Altura? There was a pretty rogue for you. He eluded the clutches of half the police in Europe, but we nailed him in Antwerp, thanks to Mr. Perrault here. As these friendly reminiscences were being indulged in, I drew nearer, and was introduced to Detective Inspector Japp, who in his turn introduced us both to his companion, Superintendent Summerhay. I need hardly ask what you are doing here, gentlemen, remarked Perrault. Japp closed one eye knowingly. No, indeed. Pretty clear case, I should say. But Perrault answered gravely. There, I differ from you. Oh, come, said Summerhay, opening his lips for the first time. Surely the whole thing is clear as daylight. The man's caught red-handed. How could he be such a fool beats me. But Japp was looking attentively at Perrault. "Hold your fire, Summerhay," he remarked jocularly. "Me and Monsieur here have met before, and there's no man's judgment I'd sooner take than his. If I'm not greatly mistaken, he's got something up his sleeve. Isn't that so, Monsieur?" Perrault smiled. "I have drawn certain conclusions, yes." Summerhay was still looking rather skeptical, but Japp continued his scrutiny of Perrault. "It's this way," he said. "So far, we've only seen the case from the outside. That's where the Yard's at a disadvantage in a case of this kind, where the murder's only out, so to speak, after the inquest. A lot depends on being on the spot first thing, and that's where Mr. Perrault's had the start of us. We shouldn't have been here as soon as this, even, if it hadn't been for the fact that there was a smart doctor on the spot who gave us the tip through the coroner. But you've been on the spot from the first, and you may have picked up some little hints. From the evidence at the inquest, Mr. Inglethorpe murdered his wife, as sure as I stand here. And if anyone but you hinted the contrary, I'd laugh in his face. I must say I was surprised the jury didn't bring it in willful murder against him right off. I think they would have, if it hadn't been for the coroner. He seemed to be holding them back. Perhaps, though, you have a warrant for his arrest in your pocket now, suggested Perrault. A kind of wooden shudder of officialdom came down from Japp's expressive countenance. "Perhaps I have, and perhaps I haven't," he remarked dryly. Perrault looked at him thoughtfully. "I am very anxious, messieurs, that he should not be arrested." "I dare say," observed Summerhay sarcastically. Japp was regarding Perrault with comical perplexity. "Can't you go a little further, Mr. Perrault? A wink's as good as a nod from you. You've been on the spot, and the Yard doesn't want to make any mistakes, you know." Perrault nodded gravely. "That is exactly what I thought. Well, I will tell you this. Use your warrant. Arrest Mr. Inglethorpe. But it will bring you no kudos. The case against him will be dismissed at once. Comme ça." And he snapped his fingers expressively. Japp's face grew grave, though Summerhay gave an incredulous snort. As for me, I was literally dumb with astonishment. I could only conclude that Perrault was mad. Japp had taken out a handkerchief, and he was gently dabbing his brow. "I daren't do it, Mr. Perrault. I'd take your word, but there's others over me who'll be asking what the devil I mean by it. Can't you give me a little more to go on?" Perrault reflected a moment. "It can be done," he said at last. "I admit I do not wish it. It forces my hand. I would have preferred to work in the dark just for the present. But what you say is very just. The word of a Belgian policeman, whose day is past, is not enough. And Alfred Inglethorpe must not be arrested. That I have sworn, as my friend Hastings here knows. See then, my good Japp, you go at once to Styles?" "Well, in about half an hour. We're seeing the coroner and the doctor first." "Good. Call for me in passing, the last house in the village. I will go with you. At Styles, Mr. Inglethorpe will give you, or if he refuses, as is probable, I will give you such proofs that shall satisfy you that the case against him could not possibly be sustained. Is that a bargain?" Hey, look, we've got another spam comment. Woo! From the same site, too. I wonder where they're pulling this, where they're pulling the channel from. "That's a bargain," said Japp heartily, "and on behalf of the Yard I'm much obliged to you, though I'm bound to confess I can't at present see the faintest possible loophole in the evidence. But you always were a marvel. So long then, monsieur." The two detectives strode away, Summerhay with an incredulous grin on his face. "Well, my friend," cried Perrault, before I could get in a word, "what do you think? Mon Dieu! I had some warm moments in that court. I did not figure to myself that the man would be so pig-headed as to refuse to say anything at all. Decidedly it was the policy of an imbecile." There are other explanations besides that of imbecility," I remarked. "For if the case against him is true, how could he defend himself except by silence?" "Why, in 1,000 ingenious ways," cried Perrault. "Say that it is I who have committed this murder. I can think of 7 most plausible stories, far more convincing than Mr. Inglethorpe's stony denials." I could not help laughing. My dear Perrault, I am sure you are capable of thinking of 70. But seriously, in spite of what I have heard you say to the detectives, you surely cannot still believe in the possibility of Alfred Inglethorpe's innocence. Why not now as much as before? Nothing has changed. But the evidence is so conclusive. Yes, too conclusive. We turned in at the gate of Leastways Cottage and proceeded up the now familiar stairs. Yes, too conclusive, continued Perrault, almost to himself. Real evidence is usually vague and unsatisfactory. It has to be examined, sifted. But here the whole thing is cut and dried. No, my friend, this evidence has been very cleverly manufactured, so cleverly that it has defeated its own ends. How do you make that out? Because, so long as the evidence against him was vague and intangible, it was very hard to disprove. But in his anxiety, the criminal has drawn the net so closely that one cut will set Mr. Inglethorpe free. I was silent, and in a minute or two Perrault continued. Let us look at the matter like this. Here's a man, let us say, who sets out to poison his wife. He has lived by his wits, as the saying goes. Presumably, therefore, he has some wits. He is not altogether a fool. Well, how does he set about it? He goes boldly to the village chemist's and purchases strychnine under his own name with a trumped-up story about a dog which is bound to be proved absurd. He does not employ the poison that night. No. He waits until he has had a violent quarrel with her, of which the whole household is cognizant, and which naturally directs their suspicions upon him. He prepares no defense, no shadow of an alibi, yet he knows that the chemist's assistant must necessarily come forward with the facts. Bah! Do not ask me to believe that any man could be so idiotic. Only a lunatic who wished to commit suicide by causing himself to be hanged would act so. Still, I do not see, I began. Neither do I see. I tell you, mon ami, it puzzles me. Me, Hercule Poirot. But if you believe him innocent, how do you explain him buying the strychnine? Very simply. He did not buy it. But Mace recognized him. I beg your pardon. He saw a man with a black beard like Mr. Inglethorpe's, and wearing glasses like Mr. Inglethorpe, and dressed in Mr. Inglethorpe's rather noticeable clothes. He could not recognize a man whom he had probably only seen in the distance, since, you remember, he himself had only been in the village a fortnight, and Mrs. Inglethorpe's dealt principally with Coots in Tadminster. Then you think, Mon ami, do you not remember the 2 points I laid stress upon? Leave the first for the moment. What was the second? The important fact that Alfred Inglethorpe wears peculiar clothes, has a black beard, and uses glasses, I quoted. Exactly. Now, suppose anyone wished to pass himself as John or Lawrence Cavendish. Would it be easy? No, I said thoughtfully. Of course an actor. But Perrault cut me short ruthlessly. And why would it not be easy? I will tell you, my friend, because they are both clean-shaven men. To make up successfully as one of these two in broad daylight, it would need an actor of genius and a certain initial facial resemblance. But in the case of Alfred Inglethorpe, all that has changed. His clothes, his beard, the glasses which hide his eyes, those are the salient points about his personal appearance. Now, what is the first instinct of the criminal? To divert suspicion from himself, is it not so? And how can he best do that? By throwing it on someone else. In this instance, there was a man ready to his hand. Everybody was predisposed to believe in Mr. Inglethorpe's guilt. It was a foregone conclusion that he would be suspected. But, to make it a sure thing, there must be tangible proof, such as the actual buying of the poison. And that, with a man of the peculiar appearance of Mr. Inglethorpe, was not difficult. Remember, this young Mace had never actually spoken to Mr. Inglethorpe. How should he doubt that the man in his clothes, with his beard and his glasses, was not Alfred Inglethorpe? It may be so, I said, fascinated by Perrault's eloquence. But if that was the case, why does he not say where he was at 6 o'clock on Monday evening? Ah, why indeed, said Perrault, calming down. If he were arrested, he would probably speak. He probably would speak, but I do not want it to come to that. I must make him see the gravity of his position. There is, of course, something discreditable behind his silence. If he did not murder his wife, he is, nevertheless, a scoundrel, and has something of his own to conceal, quite apart from the murder. What can it be? I mused, won over to Perrault's views for the moment, although still retaining a faint conviction that the obvious deduction was the correct one. Can you not guess? Asked Perrault smilingly. No, can you? Oh, yes. I had a little idea some time ago, and it has turned out to be correct. You never told me, I said reproachfully. Perrault spread out his hands apologetically. Pardon me, mon ami. You were not precisely sympathique. He turned to me earnestly. Tell me, you see now that he must not be arrested. Perhaps, I said doubtfully, for I was really quite indifferent to the fate of Alfred Inglethorpe, and thought that a good fright would do him no harm. Perrault, who was watching me intently, gave a sigh. Come, my friend, he said, changing the subject. Apart from Mr. Inglethorpe, how did the evidence at the inquest strike you? Oh, pretty much what I expected. Did nothing strike you as peculiar about it? My thoughts flew to Mary Cavendish, and I hedged. In what way? Well, Mr. Lawrence Cavendish's evidence, for instance. I was relieved. Oh, Lawrence? No, I don't think so. He's always a nervous chap. His suggestion that his mother might have been poisoned accidentally by means of the tonic she was taking, that did not strike you as strange, Hein? No, I can't say that it did. The doctors ridiculed it, of course, but it was quite a natural suggestion for a layman to make. But Monsieur Lawrence is not a layman. You told me yourself that he has been started. Oh my God. Okay, sorry about that. Throat was getting dry and started stumbling over the words. I know, right? Okay. But Monsieur Lawrence is not a layman. You told me yourself that he had started by studying medicine, and that he had taken his degree. Yes, that's true. I never thought of that. I was rather startled. It is odd. Perrault nodded. From the first, his behavior has been peculiar. Of all the household, he alone would be likely to recognize the symptoms of strychnine poisoning, and yet we find him the only member of the family to uphold strenuously the theory of death from natural causes. If it had been Monsieur John, I could have understood it. He has no technical knowledge, and is by nature unimaginative. But Monsieur Lawrence, no. And now, today, he puts forward a suggestion that he himself must have known was ridiculous. There is food for thought in this, mon ami. It is very confusing, I agreed. Then there's Mrs. Cavendish, continued Perrault. That's another who is not telling all she knows. What do you make of her attitude? I don't know what to make of it. It seems inconceivable that she should be shielding Alfred Inglethorpe, yet that is what it looks like. Perrault nodded reflectively. Yes, it is queer. One thing is certain. She overheard a good deal more of that private conversation than she was willing to admit. And yet, she is the last person one would accuse of stooping to eavesdrop. Exactly. One thing her evidence has shown me. I made a mistake. Dorcas was quite right. The quarrel did take place earlier in the afternoon, about 4 o'clock, as she said. I looked at him curiously. I had never understood his insistence on that point. Yes, a good deal that was peculiar came out today, continued Perrault. Dr. Bauerstein. Now, what was he doing up and dressed at that hour in the morning? It is astonishing to me that no one commented on the fact. He has insomnia, I believe, I said doubtfully. Which is a very good or a very bad explanation, remarked Perrault. It covers everything and explains nothing. I shall keep my eye on our clever Dr. Bauerstein. Any more faults to find with the evidence? I inquired satirically. Mon ami, replied Perrault gravely. When you find that people are not telling you the truth, look out. Now, unless I am much mistaken, at the inquest today only one, at most two persons were speaking the truth, without reservation or subterfuge. Oh, come now, Perrault. I won't cite Lawrence or Mrs. Cavendish, but there's John and Miss Howard. Surely they were speaking the truth. Both of them, my friend? One, I grant you, but both? His words gave me an unpleasant shock. Miss Howard's evidence, unimportant as it was, had been given in such a downright, straightforward manner that it had never occurred to me to doubt her sincerity. Still, I had a great respect for Perrault's sagacity, except on the occasions when he was what I described to myself as foolishly pig-headed. Do you really think so? I asked. Miss Howard has always seemed to me so essentially honest, almost uncomfortably so. Perrault gave me a curious look, which I could not quite fathom. He seemed to speak, and then checked himself. Miss Murdoch, too, I continued. There's nothing untruthful about her. No, but it was strange that she never heard a sound, sleeping next door, whereas Mrs. Cavendish, in the other wing of the building, distinctly heard the table fall. Well, she's young, and she sleeps soundly. Ah, yes, indeed, she must be a famous sleeper, that one. I did not quite like the tone of his voice, but at that moment a smart knock reached our ears, and looking out of the window, we perceived the two detectives waiting for us below. Perrault seized his hat, gave a ferocious twist to his mustache, and, carefully brushing an imaginary speck of dust from his sleeve, motioned me to precede him down the stairs. There we joined the detectives and set out for Styles. I think the appearance of the two Scotland Yard men was rather a shock, especially to John, though of course after the verdict he had realized it was only a matter of time. Still, the presence of the detectives brought the truth home to him more than anything else could have done. Perrault had conferred with Japp in a low tone on the way up, and it was the latter functionary who requested that the household, with the exception of the servants, should be assembled together in the drawing-room. I realized the significance of this. It was up to Perrault to make his boast good. Personally, I was not sanguine. Perrault might have had excellent reasons for his belief in Inglethorpe's innocence, but a man of the type of Summerhay would require tangible proofs, and these I doubted if Perrault could supply. Before very long we had all trooped into the drawing-room, the door of which Japp had closed. Perrault politely set chairs for everyone. The Scotland Yard men were the cynosure of all eyes. I think that for the first time we realized that the thing was not a bad dream, but a tangible reality. We had read of such things. Now we ourselves were actors in the drama. Tomorrow the daily papers all over England would blazon out the news in staring headlines. Mysterious tragedy in Essex. Wealthy lady poisoned. There would be pictures of Styles, snapshots of the family leaving the inquest. The village photographer had not been idle. All the things that one had read 100 times, things that happened to other people, not to oneself. And now, in this house, a murder had been committed. In front of us were the detectives in charge of the case. The well-known glib phraseology passed rapidly through my mind in the interval before Perrault opened the proceedings. I think everyone was a little surprised that it should be he and not one of the official detectives who took the initiative. Mesdames and messieurs, said Perrault, bowing as though he were a celebrity about to deliver a lecture. I have asked you to come here all together for a certain object. That object, it concerns Mr. Alfred. Inglethorpe was sitting a little by himself. I think, unconsciously, everyone had drawn his chair slightly away from him, and he gave a faint start as Perrault pronounced his name. Mr. Inglethorpe, said Perrault, addressing him directly, a very dark shadow is resting on this house, the shadow of murder. Inglethorpe shook his head sadly. My poor wife, he murmured. Poor Emily, it is terrible. I do not think, monsieur, said Perrault pointedly, that you quite realize how terrible it may be for you. And as Inglethorpe did not appear to understand, he added, Mr. Inglethorpe, you are standing in very grave danger. The two detectives fidgeted. I saw the official caution, anything you say will be used in evidence against you, actually hovering on Summerhay's lips. Perrault went on. Do you understand now, monsieur? No. What do you mean? I mean, said Perrault deliberately, that you are suspected of poisoning your wife. A little gasp ran round the circle at this plain speaking. Good heavens, cried Inglethorpe, starting up. What a monstrous idea. I poison my dearest Emily? I do not think, Perrault watched him narrowly, that you quite realize the unfavorable nature of your evidence at the inquest. Mr. Inglethorpe, knowing what I have now told you, do you still refuse to say where you were at 6 o'clock on Monday afternoon? With a groan, Alfred Inglethorpe sat down again and buried his face in his hands. Perrault approached and stood over him. Speak, he cried menacingly. With an effort, Inglethorpe raised his face from his hands. Then slowly and deliberately he shook his head. You will not speak? No. I do not believe that anyone could be so monstrous as to accuse me of what you say. Perrault nodded thoughtfully, like a man whose mind is made up. Then I must speak for you. Alfred Inglethorpe sprang up again. You? How can you speak? You do not know. He broke off abruptly. Perrault turned to face us. Mesdames and messieurs, I speak. Listen. I, Hercule Perrault, affirm that the man who entered the chemist's shop and purchased strychnine at 6 o'clock on Monday last was not Mr. Inglethorpe. For at 6 o'clock on that day, Mr. Inglethorpe was escorting Mrs. Raikes back to her home from a neighboring farm. I can produce no less than 5 witnesses to swear to having seen them together, either at 6 or just after. And, as you may know, the Abbey farm, Mrs. Raikes' home, is at least 2.5 miles distant from the village. There is absolutely no question as to the alibi. And as that's the chapter, and we've only got a few minutes left before the 2-hour mark, I think we will close the reading there for today. And next week, we will pick up again with Chapter 8, Fresh Suspicions. I think I'm going to change my vote if it'll let me. Well, it doesn't want to let me change my vote, but we'll start up a fresh poll next week for who we think. I'm definitely changing my vote to Mary. I think we've conclusively proved that Alfred is not the guilty party. Also, I may have been wrong about the whole fake beard thing, but I mean, she did focus a lot on how weird his appearance was. I suppose because it makes it easier for somebody else to fake. In any case, thank you everyone for joining me for this. Please, before you go ahead and hit that follow button. And I'm going to try something crazy here. I have not done this before, so I don't know how well it'll work, but I'm going to try it. I'm going to try to raid somebody else. So we would take the channel and we'd go to another Twitch channel, another streamer. So let me see who's available. Oh, I've been working on learning more about it. I'm trying to figure out how to do an image mask. Like, I know how to do it, but I'm terrible with graphics programs, and so I haven't been able to manage the very simple, I'm sure, task of making a white or black circle with a transparent background. Yeah, that's a little embarrassing to have to admit. But that's where I'm at. Yeah, but if you could, that would be amazing. What I'd like to do is, if you look at the screen, I'd like to be able to just have the kinetic sand portion and omit like the grayish black area around it, and that way I can lay out like a nice background behind the image and that kind of thing. I have a couple of ideas, but if I could just get that image mask, I could, move forward on that. I don't know. What category sounds good, guys? Just chatting, music, Among Us. If you guys will stick around for this. Let's do Stardew Valley. See if there's somebody there. Well, that sounds good. How about Pat Anderson? How do we do this? All right, let's see if this works. Raid. Well, that didn't work. Okay, we'll raid next time, and I will ask Meg how to do this because clearly I did not listen well enough to her. All right, well, thank you, everyone, and we will pick this up next week. We will be doing a stream on Friday. We'll do... Okay, I'll try it. I thought it was the exclamation mark. Did that work? Okay, did we actually raid? I can't tell. Is there like a delay? Huh. Okay, oh, there it is. Hey, there we go. All right, guys. That's the end of the stream.